The envelope sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I could bring myself to open it. Rain tapped against the window of my basement apartment in East Vancouver, the kind of slow November drizzle that soaks everything without you noticing. I was 34 years old, 7 years into a career I'd built from nothing, and the letter inside that envelope was going to tell me whether I still had any of it left. My name is Claire Bennett, and 2 weeks before that rainy morning, I'd been escorted out of the offices of Kerrigan and Whitfield Consulting by a security guard named Doug who used to bring me shortbread cookies his wife baked at Christmas. Doug wouldn't look at me as we rode the elevator down from the 28th floor. I didn't blame him. I wouldn't have looked at me either. I'd been a senior strategy analyst. I'd closed the Manitoba Hydro restructuring deal that everyone said couldn't be closed. I'd stayed late, skipped Thanksgiving dinners, missed my best friend's wedding in Kelowna because the Synovus pitch was due Monday. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, HR called me into a glass conference room and told me that a review of my recent work had uncovered serious concerns about billing irregularities and client confidentiality breaches. I was terminated for cause. No severance. No reference. My belongings would be couriered. I sat there in that glass box and felt the world go very quiet. I asked to see the evidence. They said the investigation was internal and confidential. I asked who had filed the complaint. They said they couldn't disclose that. I asked if I could speak to Mr. Kerrigan himself, the managing partner who had hired me out of Rotman 7 years ago. They said he was in meetings for the rest of the week. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment and called my mother in Burlington. She answered on the 4th ring, already halfway through her evening glass of Pinot Grigio, and before I could finish telling her what had happened, she sighed the sigh I'd been hearing my whole life. "Oh, Claire," she said. "Well, your father was just saying the other day that you've always been a bit scattered. My father is Richard Bennett, the managing director of Bennett Financial Group in Oakville, a man who has never in his 68 years of life said my name without some small downward inflection at the end. As if my existence were a minor disappointment he was still learning to accept. My younger brother Jordan, 31, works for him as a vice president. Jordan has always been the favorite. Jordan was a hockey captain at Upper Canada College. Jordan married a lovely girl from Rosedale named Ashley whose father owns a chain of dealerships in the GTA. Jordan has 2 perfect blonde children who call me Auntie Claire the same way you'd call a distant acquaintance. "Mom," I said, "I didn't do anything wrong. Someone set me up." "Well, that's what people say, isn't it?" My mother replied, and I could hear her refilling her glass. "Come to Jordan's birthday dinner on Saturday. Your father is hosting at the club. It'll be good for you to see family. Maybe your brother can help you find something. You know how well connected he is." I hung up and I didn't cry. I'd stopped crying over my family sometime around the age of 20. Instead, I made tea and opened my laptop and started going through every email, every file, every document I'd saved to my personal drive over 7 years. I was looking for whatever it was they claimed I'd done. I was looking for the ghost of a mistake. I didn't find it. I stayed up until 4 in the morning and I didn't find anything, because there was nothing to find. 3 days later, I flew to Toronto for Jordan's birthday because my mother had called 6 more times and because somewhere, underneath everything, I still believed that if I just showed up, if I just sat at the table, someone in that family would finally see me. I hate that about myself. I hate that it took what happened next to cure me of it. The dinner was at the Rosedale Golf Club, in a private room with walnut paneling and portraits of old men in hunting jackets. My father stood when I came in, kissed the air near my cheek, and said, "Well, the prodigal returns." My brother laughed. His wife Ashley smiled the smile of a woman who has been briefed. There were 12 people at the table, mostly my father's colleagues and their wives, plus Jordan's father-in-law and 2 of Jordan's golf buddies from the firm. The wine came. The appetizers came. I kept my eyes on my plate and answered questions in short sentences. When someone asked what I was doing these days, my father cut in before I could answer and said, "Claire is between opportunities at the moment." Again, there was a small, polite laugh around the table, the kind you give when you're not sure if something is a joke. Jordan stood up for the first toast around the main course. He held up his glass of Camus and smiled that straight white smile he'd been practicing since he was 10 years old. "To family," he said. "And to my big sister Claire, who flew all the way from Vancouver to celebrate her little brother's birthday. Claire, I know things have been rough. I know Kerrigan let you go. And honestly, sis, at this point, I think you should consider a career change. I hear the brass rail is hiring. You've always had the legs for it. The room went still for half a second. Then my father chuckled. Actually chuckled. He lifted his glass and said, "At least she'd finally be good at something." The laugh that followed was not a big laugh. It was a smaller, more uncertain laugh. The kind that spreads around a table when powerful men have said something and no one is quite sure how to react. Ashley laughed. Jordan's friends laughed. My mother looked at her plate. One of the wives, a woman named Diane, made a small sound of protest and then covered it with a sip of water. I sat very still. I could feel the heat climbing up my neck. I could feel every old humiliation lining up behind this one like dominoes. I thought about leaving. I thought about throwing my wine in my father's face. I thought about 100 things I would think about later, in bed, at 3 in the morning, for the rest of my life. Instead, I stood up. I put my napkin on the table. I said, "Happy birthday, Jordan," and I walked out of the room and down the carpeted hallway and out the front doors of the club into the cold October night. I took a cab to the airport and I got on the red-eye back to Vancouver and I did not sleep the whole way home. That was the envelope I couldn't open. 3 days later it came in the mail. My father's handwriting on the front. No return address needed. I knew his script like I knew my own name. When I finally opened it, there was no letter inside. Just a check for $5,000 and a post-it note in his tight accountant's hand that read, "For your relocation. It's time you stopped drifting." I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at that check for a long time, and then I did something I hadn't done in all my years of being Richard Bennett's daughter. I tore it in half. I tore it in half again. I tore it into so many pieces that they looked like confetti, and I swept them into my palm and dropped them into the green bin under the sink. That was the moment something in me changed. I don't know how else to describe it. It was as if a door I'd been leaning against my whole life finally gave way, and I fell through it into a room I hadn't known was there. The next morning, I updated my resume. I called 2 former classmates from Rotman. I applied to everything that moved. And in the afternoon, I walked down to the little cafe on Commercial Drive where I sometimes went to think, and I ordered a flat white and sat by the window, and that is where I met the man who changed everything. He was maybe 60, gray-haired, with the weathered face of someone who spent time outdoors. He wore a navy pea coat and old leather boots and he was reading a paperback copy of Alice Munro. He took the seat across from mine because the cafe was full. He apologized. I told him it was fine. He noticed the notebook open beside my laptop, the lists of names and firms I was planning to cold email. "Job hunting?" he asked. "Something like that." "What's your field?" I told him. "Strategy, consulting. Energy and infrastructure. 7 years at Kerrigan and Whitfield, recently departed." He nodded slowly, the way older men nod when they're taking something in. He introduced himself as Thomas. He didn't give a last name. We talked for maybe an hour. He asked intelligent questions about the Manitoba Hydro deal, about the regulatory environment for LNG in British Columbia, about carbon pricing and Indigenous consultation and the things I'd spent my career thinking about. He listened the way almost no one in my life had ever listened to me. Before he left, he slid a business card across the table. It had only a phone number on it. "Call me on Monday at 10, he said. "I might have something worth your time." I watched him walk out into the rain and I thought, he's probably nothing. He's probably no one. But on Monday at 10, I called. The woman who answered asked my name and told me to hold. 30 seconds later, Thomas was on the line, and he asked me to come to an address downtown at 2 o'clock. The address turned out to be the 34th floor of a tower on Burrard Street. The plaque on the wall in the lobby read Laurentide Capital Partners, a name I knew the way anyone in Canadian finance knows it. Laurentide is one of the largest private investment firms in the country, with stakes in pipelines and railways and port infrastructure from Halifax to Prince Rupert. I had pitched to them once, 4 years earlier, and been told politely that they weren't taking outside consultants. Thomas met me at reception. Only he wasn't Thomas, not really. The receptionist called him Mr. Ashford. Thomas Ashford. I'd never met him, but I knew the name. Everyone in the industry knew the name. He was the chairman. In his office, with a view of Cole Harbour that made my legs weak. He sat down across from me and he told me why he'd been in that cafe. I've been watching Kerrigan and Whitfield for a while, he said. We were considering a partnership with them last year. When we did our due diligence, your name kept coming up. The Manitoba deal. The Synovus restructuring. 2 or 3 others. You were the quiet engine behind half of what they claimed as their own work. I didn't know what to say. Then, 3 weeks ago, he continued. I heard through a back channel that you'd been terminated for cause. Billing irregularities. Confidentiality breaches. Very vague, very public. And I thought, that is a remarkable coincidence. Because 6 weeks before that, a small firm here in Vancouver submitted a proposal to my team on a port infrastructure engagement. A firm called Bennett Financial Group. Out of Oakville. Run by a man named Richard Bennett. The room went cold. The proposal they submitted, Thomas said quietly, contained strategic analysis that I recognized. Because I had seen it before. In a deck your firm pitched to us the previous winter. A deck you had written. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My team passed on the engagement, he said. But I made a phone call or 2. And I learned some things I think you deserve to know. He told me what he had learned. He told me that 6 months earlier, my brother Jordan had reached out to an old golf buddy who worked at Kerrigan and Whitfield. He told me that my father's firm had been losing major accounts for 3 years running, that Bennett Financial was hemorrhaging money, that they were desperate for a lifeline in the form of institutional business. He told me that Jordan had, over a series of drinks at a club in Yorkville, obtained copies of several of my strategic frameworks. That he had lightly reworked them and used them in proposals to 6 firms. That when word started to circulate in Toronto that Bennett Financial was poaching Kerrigan's work, Jordan had needed a scapegoat. And he had needed that scapegoat removed from Kerrigan before she could defend herself. Your brother told them you were the source of the leak, Thomas said. He told them you'd been feeding him material for months. He gave them a fabricated email trail. And Kerrigan, instead of investigating properly, took the path of least resistance. They fired you to make it go away. I sat in that office and I felt something I had never felt before. It was not grief. It was not even anger, exactly. It was a kind of terrible clarity. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Thomas Ashford looked at me for a long moment. Because I need a head of strategic advisory for our Western portfolio, he said. And I've never hired anyone I wanted more. But I also wanted you to know what happened. You deserve to know. What you do with it is up to you. I asked for a week to think about it. He gave me 2. I did not go back to my mother. I did not call my father. I did not send Jordan a message. Instead, I hired a lawyer. Her name was Priya Dhaliwal, a litigator in Gastown who'd been recommended to me by an old Rotman classmate. She was 42, sharp as a broken bottle, and when I laid out what had happened in her conference room, she listened without interrupting and then said, Claire, if half of what you're telling me is true, we are going to make your brother wish he'd chosen a different sister. I went back to work, quietly, in my apartment, with the curtains drawn. I pulled every file I still had. Every draft, every time-stamped document, every email I'd ever written on a personal device for convenience. I reconstructed the chain of custody for every one of the frameworks Jordan had stolen. I matched dates. I matched phrasing. I found my fingerprints on work that had shown up in Bennett Financial proposals 11 months later. And then, through a series of careful introductions, I met someone else. Her name was Yvonne Beauchamp. She was 59 years old, a Quebecoise woman who had moved to Toronto in the 90s. For 12 years, she had been the senior bookkeeper at Bennett Financial Group. 2 years ago, my father had terminated her, citing performance issues. She had since been working nights as a cleaner for an office services company that, by coincidence or not, contracted with the very Kerrigan and Whitfield building where I had once worked. Priya found her through a referral. Yvonne agreed to meet me in a Tim Hortons in Mississauga on a grey Saturday morning in December. I flew in for the day and I sat across from her in a vinyl booth and she told me, in a soft voice with a Montreal accent, that she had been fired from Bennett Financial because she had raised questions. Questions about invoices. Questions about a pattern of payments to a numbered Alberta company that appeared to have no employees and no office. Questions that my father had told her, in his own office, to stop asking. I kept copies, she said. I kept everything. I knew one day someone would come. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a brown accordion folder. Inside it were statements, invoices, internal memos, email printouts going back 4 years. She laid them on the table between our double-doubles and she pushed them toward me. "Your father," she said, "he has been moving money. Not much, but consistent. And his son, your brother, he knows." I saw them fight about it once, when they did not know I was in the copy room. I looked at Yvonne Beauchamp and I thought about Doug the security guard. I thought about all the invisible people who had watched my family for years and had seen things the family itself couldn't see. I thought about how the powerful always assume the people around them aren't paying attention. "Yvonne," I said, "why would you do this for me? You don't know me." She smiled. Her teeth were a little crooked. She said, "Because your father, he called me stupid. In French. He thought I did not understand. He called me une vieille conne. For 12 years I kept his books honest, and he called me that. So yes. I do this for you. And I do this for me." I took her hand. I told her that if what was in that folder was real, I would not forget her. I told her I would make sure of it. She nodded and sipped her coffee, and she looked out the window at the snow beginning to fall over the parking lot. Back in Vancouver, I accepted Thomas Ashford's offer. I started at Laurentide on the 15th of January, with a compensation package that was more than twice what I'd earned at Carrigan. I kept my head down. I did the work. I didn't tell anyone in my family. They didn't ask. But in the evenings, and on weekends, and in every spare hour I could find, I worked with Priya. We built a file. We pieced together what Jordan had done, with the documents I had and the ones Yvonne had provided. We identified 3 separate acts of wire fraud, a clear case of corporate espionage, and what Priya believed was a strong civil claim for defamation and tortious interference against both my brother and my father. We also quietly alerted the Ontario Securities Commission about the numbered company. That piece was out of our hands. It would move at its own speed. In March, I sent a formal letter, through Priya, to the managing partners at Carrigan and Whitfield. The letter laid out, in cold precise language, everything we had uncovered. It did not demand anything. It simply provided information, and it noted that a civil filing was being prepared and that copies of the file had been forwarded to certain regulatory bodies. 2 weeks later, Mr. Carrigan himself called me. He asked if I could fly to Toronto. He said the firm wanted to make things right. I flew on a Tuesday. I sat in the same glass conference room where I had been fired 6 months earlier. Mr. Carrigan, a white-haired man of 70 with rheumy blue eyes, apologized to me personally. The firm, he said, had re-examined the original complaint and determined that the evidence against me had been fabricated. My termination was being reversed and reclassified as a wrongful dismissal. A settlement was proposed. It was generous. It included a public retraction, a significant financial component, and a letter of reference from Mr. Carrigan himself. I accepted. I did not gloat. I thanked him and I left. That night, my phone rang. It was my mother. She had heard from someone, somewhere, that I was in town. She wanted to know why I hadn't called. She wanted to know if I would come to a family dinner on Saturday. My father's 70th birthday. At the club. Everyone would be there. I almost said no. I had spent so many months refusing to think about them. I had learned, finally, to live in a world where I didn't need my father to see me. But then I thought of Yvonne Beauchamp in that Tim Hortons. I thought of Priya's file. I thought of the ledger of wrongs that had not yet been balanced. "I'll be there," I said. The Rosedale Golf Club had put up a banner for my father's birthday. Gold lettering on navy. 100 people. The same walnut paneling, the same portraits, the same smell of old money and wood smoke and expensive cologne. My brother Jordan was at the door greeting guests when I came in. He blinked when he saw me. He recovered quickly. "Claire," he said. "Didn't know if you'd make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. My father was at the center of the room, holding court with a group of his old partners. He saw me from across the room, and he nodded once, the curtest of acknowledgments, and returned to his conversation. My mother came over and kissed my cheek and told me I looked tired. Ashley waved from the bar without approaching. I waited. I drank 1 glass of sparkling water, slowly, and I waited. I had timed this carefully. At 7:15, a man entered the club whom no one was expecting. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing a dark charcoal suit. He handed his coat to the attendant and walked into the main room as if he belonged there. Heads turned. My father's expression flickered. Thomas Ashford was not on the guest list. Thomas Ashford was someone my father had courted, unsuccessfully, for a decade. Thomas crossed the room. He nodded at a few acquaintances. And then he came to stand beside me. "Claire," he said, loud enough to carry. "Good to see you. Is this your father?" The room had gone quiet without anyone quite realizing it was quiet. My father stepped forward, smiling his most practiced smile, and extended a hand. "Richard Bennett," he said. "An honor, Miss Ashford. I didn't realize you knew my daughter." "Your daughter," Thomas said, "is Laurentide's new head of strategic advisory for Western Canada. I recruited her myself in November. She's been running our largest infrastructure file for 3 months. We consider her one of the most talented strategists in the country." I watched the blood leave my father's face by degrees. I watched my brother, across the room, freeze with a drink halfway to his mouth. I watched my mother's hand drift to her pearls. "Claire," my father managed, "never mentioned." "She wouldn't," Thomas said lightly. "She's discreet. It's one of her virtues." And then Thomas turned to me, and he gave me the smallest nod, and he stepped back. I stepped forward. "Dad," I said. "Jordan. There's something I want to say. Since everyone is here." The room was now entirely quiet. Even the servers had paused at the edges. 6 months ago," I said, my voice steady, "I was fired from Kerrigan and Whitfield for cause. The cause given was billing fraud and confidentiality breach. Neither was true. The evidence was fabricated. I have spent the last 6 months proving that, with the help of my lawyer and a number of people who came forward on their own. Kerrigan has issued a full retraction and a settlement. I'm not here to talk about that." I let the silence sit. "I'm here because the person who fabricated the evidence was my brother. Jordan stole my work. He used it in proposals for Bennett Financial Group. When he thought he might be caught, he told Kerrigan's partners that I was the leak, and he provided them with forged emails to prove it. My father knew. My father approved it. And when the firm that started to crumble around them needed another cushion, they turned to a numbered Alberta company that existed for no reason I can determine other than to move money out of clients' accounts." A woman near the bar said, "Oh my God." The Ontario Securities Commission began a formal inquiry into Bennett Financial Group last month, I continued. My lawyer Priya Dhaliwal filed a civil claim against my brother and my father personally 2 days ago. It was served this morning. Jordan, I believe the sheriff caught you at the office around 10. I understand Dad got his at home around noon. Jordan made a sound. It was not a word. My father had not moved. "I don't want anything from either of you," I said. "I don't want an apology. I don't want an explanation. I don't want your money. I never did. What I wanted, all I ever wanted, was for one of you to have looked at me and seen what was there. You couldn't. You chose not to. That's your tragedy. It isn't mine anymore." I paused. I looked around the room, at the stricken faces of my father's partners and their wives. "There's one more thing. I want everyone here to know the name Yvonne Beauchamp. She was my father's bookkeeper for 12 years. He fired her when she asked questions he didn't like. She is the reason any of this was possible. On Monday, I am offering her a role at Laurentide, heading up compliance for our Eastern operations, at a salary my father never dreamed of paying her. She said yes last week." I turned toward the door. And then I turned back. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said. And I walked out. I did not take a cab this time. I walked. It was a clear cold Saturday night in Toronto, and I walked down Yonge Street for a long time, past the lit windows and the Saturday night crowds. And I thought about how strange it was to feel, for the first time in my adult life, entirely weightless. In the weeks that followed, things unfolded. The civil case settled quickly, the evidence was too strong to contest. My brother lost his position at Bennett Financial and, by the following autumn, his marriage. My father was stripped of his registration by the regulators and his firm went into receivership. Charges relating to the numbered company are still working their way through the courts. I do not follow them closely. Priya sends me updates when there is something I need to know. My mother called me, twice, in the spring. I did not answer. Eventually, she stopped. Yvonne Beauchamp relocated to Toronto and took over the compliance function at Laurentide's Eastern office. Her daughter, who lives in Montreal, cried when Yvonne told her the salary. Yvonne sent me a card at Christmas with a pressed maple leaf inside it and the words, in French, for my friend who remembered. I still live in East Vancouver. I bought a small townhouse not far from the cafe where I met Thomas. I have a dog now, a rescue mutt named Biscuit who is terrified of the recycling truck. I have friends who have become family. I go to Yvonne's for Christmas when I can get to Toronto. On my desk at Laurentide, there is one photograph. It is of me and Yvonne, taken at her swearing in as a compliance officer, both of us laughing. It is the only picture of family I keep at work. It is the only one I need. Sometimes I think about that rainy morning in my basement apartment, staring at the envelope on the kitchen table, and I want to reach back through time and tell the woman I was then that the worst day of her life was about to become the first day of her real one. That the door she'd been leaning against her whole life was finally going to give way. That the people who had refused to see her were going to be, in the end, the smallest figures in her story. I don't believe in revenge. I don't believe in it the way my brother meant it. Anyway, what I believe in is the long quiet work of being seen by the right people, and of becoming the kind of person who sees others in return. That is the only inheritance I ever wanted. And, in the end, I gave it to myself.